Welcome to my messy studio, everyone. My name is Mark, and I'm an artist and an art professor. And in this video, we're going to talk about different kinds of black pencils commonly used in drawing. Graphite pencils, carbon pencils, charcoal pencils, pastel pencils, and wax-based color pencils. I'm going to demonstrate the various properties of each, talk about their pros and cons, and give you my brand recommendations. Let's get started. If you've seen my channel, you know that its primary focus is pen and ink drawing. But I also do a lot of work in dry media, and one of the benefits and curses of being an artist for over 30 years is that I have a massive accumulation of pencils of every possible kind. So, while I'm not running an art supply store, and my pencil hoard is by no means encyclopedic, I do have enough different kinds of pencils and enough experience working with them to go through almost all the different pencil types and tell you what they're good for. Let's start with the most basic and most pervasive form of black drawing implement, the graphite pencil. But before I do, please give me a second to tell you about my YouTube membership program, which gives you access to a library of long-form classes and 2 new classes every single month. Graphite began to be used as a drawing tool in the 16th century, when deposits of high-quality graphite were discovered in England. But it took a back seat to black chalk well until the 18th century, when the French artist and inventor Nicolas Jacques Conté invented a method of mixing powdered graphite with fine clay, creating a more uniform product that could be manufactured in different hardnesses. With the decline of high-quality black chalk, graphite, along with charcoal, became the predominant drawing material it is today. Graphite pencils, of course, come in a large range of hardnesses, depending on the ratio of clay and graphite in the lead. Pencil hardness is indicated by the HB scale, with 2H, 4H, 6H increasing in hardness, and 2B, 4B, and 6B increasing in softness. Pencils in the H scale are often used by draftsmen and architects for highly detailed technical drawings. But for most drawing purposes, HB or softer is preferable. So for our tests, we're going to leave the harder pencils out and use pencils that are HB and softer. The first test is the chalkiness-greasiness test. All pencils fall somewhere on the greasy and chalky continuum, depending on the type of binders being used. If a pencil has minimal binding material or relies on gum binders such as gum tragacanth or methyl cellulose, then it'll be chalky. However, many manufacturers also add waxes and oils to make the material smoother and to help it adhere to the paper. And the more waxes and oils are added, the greasier the pencil becomes. While the combination of binders used in pencils are a carefully guarded secret, you can get a sense of where a pencil falls on the chalky-greasy scale by simply working with it. Chalkier pencils will feel scratchier, and the lines they produce will have a greater tendency to smear, whereas oilier pencils will feel smoother and the lines will be less prone to smudging. Generally speaking, chalkier pencils require rougher textured paper to work well, because these materials lack the inherent stickiness to adhere to smoother paper, whereas oilier pencils will work well on both smooth and rough paper. Later in this video, we'll talk about other reasons why it's important to be aware of where the material you're drawing with falls on the chalky, greasy scale. Unlike other materials that require the addition of waxes and binders to feel greasy, graphite is the reverse, being a naturally greasy material that requires the addition of clay to feel chalky. This is why 6B and 8B pencils will feel greasier than HB and 2B pencils. However, let's give graphite a rating as a category. On a scale of 1 through 10, with 1 being completely chalky, like a chalk pastel, and 10 being super greasy, like a wax-based color pencil, graphite generally falls somewhere on the greasier side, being about a 6, or maybe even a 6.5. This is dependent on the pencil's softness, since softer grades of pencils will have a higher percentage of graphite in them and therefore feel greasier. The next test we'll conduct is for value. Since all these pencils are black materials, the value scale begins at 50% gray being 1 and pure solid black being a 10. Graphite is naturally a dark gray material, so even at its darkest iteration, its value range is limited, and other materials tend to go much darker. This grayness is exacerbated by the shininess of the material when built up, which often makes the darkest values appear even lighter. So, while the value of graphite pencils will vary depending on the hardness, in general, graphite pencils rank at about a 5 on the darkness scale. Now, Staedtler, the company that makes this pencil, has dealt with this problem by adding carbon to their 8B pencils, which produces a much darker value than 8B in other brands. So here is an 8B made by Faber-Castell, which, as you can see, is only just a little bit darker, or maybe even equivalent to the 6B pencil in the Staedtler line. Unfortunately, this form of cheating, adding carbon, feels out of place, with the 8B pencil going much darker and more matte than their 6B pencil. This is something we'll talk more about when we get to Staedtler's other line of pencils, which are carbon graphite hybrids. In the smudge test, which will also rank on a 1 through 10 scale, with 1 being something like a color pencil which barely moves when you try to smear it, to 10 being vine charcoal that almost blows off the paper, I would rank graphite at about a 4. This is a good balance, allowing you to use graphite for both sharp, linear techniques and in soft blending methods. In the erasing test, once again on a 1 through 10 scale, with 1 being impervious to erasing and 10 flying off the page as soon as an eraser touches it, here it really depends on the grade of pencil you're working with. So the HB erases very well, and the softer grades slightly less so. Still, in general, graphite tends to erase fairly well, regardless of the softness grade, and I'm going to rank it at about a 7. And lastly, let's test graphite's water solubility. This is good to know because pencils are often used to do underdrawings for wet media techniques such as watercolor, or used in a variety of other wet media techniques. So this is the HB pencil. Here is a 2B pencil and a 6B pencil. On the water solubility test, which runs from 1 being highly resistant to 10 being completely soluble, graphite ranks relatively low at about a 3, creating only slight residue when you go over it with water. Now let's do a little drawing with these graphite pencils, and as I draw, I'll tell you why and when I would use graphite, what it's good for, and when you should avoid it. Graphite pencils are really great for a variety of drawing styles, but because of their relative hardness and the ability to sharpen them to a very fine point, small-scale, detailed work is where they excel. To prove my point, here is a drawing done by the 19th century French painter Ingres. He did quite a few of these, and if you're not familiar with them, do check them out. These drawings are surprisingly tiny in real life and full of incredibly minute detail. Another benefit of graphite is its pleasant smoothness in comparison with many other types of drawing materials. Graphite was originally used as a lubricant for machine parts, and its lubricating properties allows the tip of the pencil to glide effortlessly across the page, even when working on rough paper. And while other oil-based materials have a similar feel, those materials are not nearly as erasable as graphite. Furthermore, its greasy stickiness means that it's suitable for almost every kind of paper, from smooth Bristol to rough molded papers, and even seems to shine on that cheap printer paper that otherwise isn't good for much of anything. Graphite is also the best medium for underdrawing for watercolor, since it's relatively water resistant and its light gray residue doesn't muddy the washes you put over it. In this drawing, I started with an HB pencil for the sketch and early stages. Nothing is as easy as graphite for light sketching, but you do have to be careful when starting with a hard, pointy pencil, since it can score soft drawing paper, and those scored lines will then show up as light lines when you try to shade over them. This is why when you do your initial sketch, it's a good idea to hold your pencil on its side and sketch with a broad line. Blending stumps work very well with graphite, and I enjoy using them to get very soft transitions early in the drawing. However, since I'm not a fan of perfectly smooth drawing, I like to balance areas of stumping with more textured, form contouring strokes placed on top. The main disadvantage of graphite is its grayness. That doesn't seem apparent when you work with it alone, but when you compare graphite to charcoal, even the darkest graphite looks gray in comparison. It can also, in very strongly built up areas, take on an unpleasant silvery shininess that will make your darks look even weaker and make your work much more difficult to photograph. Spraying your drawing with a matte fixative can resolve that issue, and is something I recommend since graphite drawings, unless stored properly, have a tendency to smear. But if you don't mind the grayness, a number of brands work well. My favorite I made by Staedtler, their Mars Lumograph series, but Prismacolor Turquoise and Faber-Castell 900 series pencils are also very nice. One thing to keep in mind is that there's unfortunately no international treaty governing the HB scale, and it's therefore applied differently from brand to brand. So for example, a 4B pencil in one brand might be different in softness in another brand. This is why, whatever brand you choose, get a range of pencil in one brand. For those starting out, I recommend getting an HB, a 2B, a 4B, and a 6B. Do you need a pencil in every hardness? No, you don't. When starting out, it does help you with controlling your values, but as you gain experience, you'll find that 1 or 2 hardnesses of pencils will do everything, depending on the kind of work you're doing. And for underdrawing, I recommend using an HB pencil, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And for underdrawing for watercolor, I recommend using an HB pencil, which has that perfect balance of light value and erasability. Anything harder will be too light to see well and could potentially scrape a delicate watercolor paper. Anything softer might be more difficult to erase. The great thing about graphite is that it always sits on the surface of the paper and can be erased once the washes are put down. Here is the completed drawing. Now let's talk about another pencil category, the charcoal pencil. Charcoal is probably the oldest drawing material we have, along with naturally occurring black chalk. But in its pure form, it had a limited value as a drawing material, being used mainly for creating underdrawings for paintings, where it was put down in very light lines, which were then reinforced with ink or paint before being brushed away. This natural charcoal, sold in sticks and sometimes called willow or vine charcoal, is still used and appreciated by many artists to do light, rapid sketching. But the charcoal material used in pencils is pretty new, invented at the end of the 19th century. This charcoal, called compressed charcoal, is created by putting regular charcoal in a press and adding various binders, gums, waxes, and oils to create a material that is denser, darker, and stickier. While natural chalks were the predominant drawing tool in the 15th to 17th century, being supplanted by synthetic chalks by the 18th, compressed charcoal along with graphite dominated the 19th and 20th century dry media, being cheaper, more consistent, and more versatile. Like graphite, charcoal comes in a variety of hardnesses, and though you sometimes see charcoal pencils graded on the HB scale, more often nowadays these pencils are simply marked hard, medium, soft, and extra soft. Let's take a few of these pencils through my rating scale and see how they perform. In the chalky, greasy scale, charcoal falls on the chalky side, probably around a 2 or maybe even a 2.5, since the material usually contains some degree of oil or wax binders to keep it together, resulting in a stickiness not found in regular vine or willow charcoal. In the darkness test, One, two, three, four, 5. In the darkness test, this is a hard, this is a medium, and this is a soft. You can see these pencils go very dark, especially the softest ones, but not to the extreme of darkness, so I give these about an 8 or an 8.5 overall. This is a natural material, and there is some 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is a natural material, and there is some variability here, however. In the smudge test, here's the hard, here's the medium, and here is the soft. You'll find that these pencils smear very, very well. Almost to the point where you no longer see the original strokes. This can be a good or bad thing depending on how you're using them. The harder grades can be used for sharp linear techniques if you're careful, but really charcoal is at its best when stumped, blended, and smudged. So I would give this in the smudge test about an 8.5. In the erasability test, so once again, here's the hard, here is the soft, and here is the medium. The erasability is variable, with the hard erasing fairly well, and the softer pencils slightly less so. So on the erasability scale, I would put it perhaps slightly above graphite at a 7.5 or maybe even an 8. And in water solubility, here again is the hard, here's the medium, and here is the soft. Let's try washing it away. So you can see it doesn't wash away entirely, but it is fairly water soluble. So I'm going to give it about a 9. Let's draw a bit with this pencil and discuss what it's good for. Charcoal pencils come in a range of hardnesses and are therefore a very versatile material that can be used in large and small scale drawings. But where it shines is in larger work where strong contrast and soft blending is needed. On white paper, on its own, it can look a bit scratchy and harsh. But when paired with a blending stump, it can be used to create drawings of stunning atmospheric softness and tonal nuance. Here is an example of its use by the great 19th century portraitist John Singer Sargent, who used charcoal paired with a blending stump to create effects that compete with his paintings in their softness, virtuoso handling, and psychological penetration. One of my all-time favorite techniques is called charcoal reduction, which is what I'm demonstrating in this drawing. A stick of extra soft compressed charcoal is smeared onto the paper and then blended smooth with a chamois cloth, creating an even gray tone. This lets you work from the midtone in both directions, going darker with the charcoal and lighter with a kneaded eraser. This is a very effective, fast technique that lets you establish a strong range of contrast and create very soft atmospheric effects. And while this can be done with other black pencils, charcoal is the preferred material here since it has both the quality of being very dark, but is also very blendable and erasable. Some of my favorite charcoal pencils I made by Faber-Castell, their Pitt line, but Conte and Cretacolor also makes very fine charcoal pencils. Two brands I would avoid, however, are the charcoal pencils made by the company Generals, which I find to be of inferior quality, and those made by Derwent, since their charcoal pencils are graded by value, light, medium, dark, rather than hardness. This means that their light pencil is gray, their medium pencil is slightly darker, and their dark is the darkest one. Why you need charcoal of different values is beyond me, and I'd rather buy pencils graded on hardness instead. Here is the completed drawing. Now let's talk about a somewhat unique category, oil-based charcoal. The charcoal, or possibly carbon, in these pencils is impregnated with some kind of oily binder, which makes the material harder and stickier. To my mind, something like a hybrid between charcoal and wax-based color pencils. A number of companies produce these pencils, but here are my favorites. The Pitt oil base, made by Faber-Castell, which comes in a variety of hardnesses, ranging from extra hard to extra soft. Then we have the Nero pencils made by Cretacolor, which also come in a variety of hardnesses. And then this pencil made by Kohinoor, their Gioconda pencil, which I believe only comes in a single hardness. Let's run these pencils through the tests. The first, chalkiness and greasiness. As the name suggests, these pencils are on the greasier side, perhaps generally a little greasier than graphite, so about a 7 or even a 7.5. Because these pencils are essentially charcoal, they run pretty dark, but the additional binder makes them slightly darker than charcoal. So if regular charcoal pencils rate at about an 8, these rate about an 8.5, depending on the hardness grade. On the smudgeability test, these pencils resist smudging almost as well as a color pencil. So you can see with the blending stump, they barely move. So I'm going to give them a low rating on the smudge test, approximately a 3. On the erasability scale, they are relatively poor erasers. Again, they're oil-based, making them similar to a wax-based color pencil. Now, in the harder grades, they actually erase fairly well, maybe as well as the charcoal and the graphite pencils, but then as the pencils go softer and the oil binder in them increases, they become less and less erasable. So once you get to the Kohinoor Negro, it erases fairly poorly, staining the paper. So I'm going to rate them at about I'm going to give them a 3. In the water solubility test, these pencils are fairly strongly resistant to water, again, depending on the grade. So as you start working towards the softer pencils, they become almost entirely water resistant. While their darkness and low erasability makes them unsuitable for underdrawing for aqueous media, they're very useful in mixed media techniques where they work well in combination with washes, with gouache, and other types of water-based paint. Oil-based charcoal is one of my favorite pencil types, having many of the properties I enjoy without many of the properties I find irritating. For example, they have the pleasant smoothness of graphite, yet are able to go much darker without the annoying gloss. They go as dark as charcoal, but without the annoying smudginess. They have the smudge resistance of color pencils, but are more erasable. And like graphite and color pencil, their relative greasiness allows them to work on a larger variety of paper than charcoal, even paper that is very smooth. The Pitt oil-based, made by Faber-Castell, is my favorite for smaller scale work, though I find that the hard and medium pencils are too light and that the soft and extra soft work better. The Nero pencils, made by Cretacolor, are generally softer and darker in value, but don't retain their points as well, making them better for larger work. However, since the Pitt oil base and the Nero pencils are similar materials, they can be used together. This is something I did in this drawing, where most of the drawing is done with the Pitt oil base, and the darker values are done with the Nero pencil. Oil charcoal works for drawing styles that are more linear, since it doesn't blend well. But the good thing is that there's nothing, not the church, nor the state, nor your mother, preventing you from using more than one material in a drawing. This means that you can start the drawing in regular charcoal, blend it to your liking, and then complete your drawing with oil-based charcoal, giving your drawing the benefit of the airy softness of regular charcoal and the sharpness of oil charcoal. Here is the completed drawing. Now let's talk about carbon pencils, which are made from carbon derived from the burning of various oils, mixed with clay and other binding agents. The material is similar in feel to compressed charcoal, but is often denser and darker with a slightly smoother, waxier feel. Here are two popular brands of carbon pencils. This one is Wolf's Carbon, and this one is the carbon pencil made by Conte. Wolf's Carbon comes in 4 different hardness grades, HB, 2B, 4B, and 6B, while Conte also has 4 grades, H, HB, 2B, and 3B. Wolf's Carbon pencils are generally harder and lighter than Conte, with their 6B pencils probably equivalent to the Conte 2B. The leads in Wolf Carbon are also narrower, making them better suited for small-scale work. Conte, in an effort to make things complicated, also makes another kind of carbon pencil, which they call Pierre Noir. These are very similar to carbon pencils, but have a slightly cooler, more blue color to them, and are perhaps a little smoother, either because the pigment is finer or the binder has a waxier formulation. In practice, these pencils work almost identically to the other carbon pencils. In the chalky, greasy tests, these pencils are slightly oilier feeling than charcoal pencils, but this could be because carbon pigment is finer than charcoal particles, giving a stronger impression of smoothness. I would generally rate these pencils about a 4 on this scale. In the darkness test, these pencils vary depending on the hardness, but are generally darker than charcoal. So here is a 2B Wolf's Carbon pencil. Here is a 4B. Here is a 6B. The Conte Carbon pencils are about the same in terms of value. Actually, you know what? A little bit lighter. And the Conte tends to run a little bit darker. Again, depending on the hardness. So that was an HB, this is a 2B, this is a 3B. So on the value range, they are similar to charcoal, but go a touch darker, so I'm going to rank them a 9. In the smudge test, I find that this material is a little bit stickier than charcoal and smudges less. That gives this material an advantage over charcoal in that it can be used in a wider variety of papers. So from rough paper to relatively smooth paper. Unlike graphite though, this material doesn't work terribly well on super smooth, slick paper. So where does it fall on the smudge test? Well, a little bit less smudgy than charcoal, about a 6.5. In the erasing test, I find that this material is slightly less erasable than charcoal. So here are the Wolf's Carbon pencils. Let's just try those for their erasing properties. Again, this is dependent on the grade of the pencil, with the harder pencils erasing a little bit better and the softer pencils erasing slightly worse. So once again, since these erase slightly worse than charcoal, I'm going to rate them at about a 6. And in the water solubility test, let's put down a few of these. I find that these are less water soluble than charcoal. Giving off a slight residue. So I'd rank these about a 5. For underdrawing, the semi-water resistant properties of carbon pencils allow you to do pencil and wash drawings by putting down lines in carbon and then using a wet brush to create washes. This is a technique that I demonstrated using Conte red chalk pencils in one of my previous videos and also works super well with carbon pencils. Carbon pencils are also some of my favorite materials to work with, being darker, smoother, and less smudgy than charcoal. And their slight greasiness makes them better for working on smoother paper. Their ability to maintain strong textures and yet be soft enough for blending was fully exploited by the French post-impressionist Georges Seurat to make this drawing on strongly textured paper. To be accurate, he was working with Conte sticks in this drawing, which have a slightly different, waxier formulation, but close enough. One of my favorite ways of using these is to start with carbon, shade a little, and then smudge the whole thing with a paper towel. If I was using charcoal, this would rub the entire drawing away, but in this case, the lines give off a light gray tone, but the sharpness of the lines is retained. The resulting gray tone can be erased out to create lighter values, similar to charcoal reduction. The process can be repeated as many times as you wish, creating drawings with softness and tonal nuance, as well as linear sharpness. For smaller detailed work, I tend to work with Wolf's Carbon, but for larger work and work that needs greater softness, I reach for Conte Pierre Noir. These materials work perfectly well together, however, and I often use both in the same drawing, starting off with Wolf's Carbon and finishing up the Conte... For smaller detailed work, I tend to work with Wolf... 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. For smaller, more detailed work, I reach for Wolf's Carbon, but for larger work, or work that needs greater softness, I use Conte Pierre Noir. These materials work perfectly well together, however, and I often use both in the same drawing, starting with Wolf's Carbon and finishing up with Conte Pierre Noir for the deepest darks. Here is the final drawing. To complicate things, the company Staedtler has recently come out with a line of graphite carbon hybrid pencils called Mars Lumograph Black that I have yet to try. So here are a few of them. The idea here is to cut down on the downsides of graphite, its lack of strong darks and shininess, while hopefully retaining the upsides, its smoothness and hardness. The idea of mixing graphite with carbon is not new and is something that Staedtler already does in their 8B pencils in their regular graphite line. But let's see how these pencils perform in my series of tests. In the chalky greasy test, as expected, these pencils are exactly between carbon and graphite. So if carbon is around a 4 and graphite is about a 7, these would be perhaps about a 5. Let's see how they perform in the value range. So I've already started on the HB. Here is the 4B, which is a little bit darker. The 4B, the 6B. So one thing I'm noticing is that the softer pencils contain a greater proportion of carbon, which makes them darker. So that the 8B pencil is about the equivalent of a full-on carbon pencil. And by the way, the 8B in the black is exactly the same material as the regular Staedtler 8B pencils. So in the darkness scale, because of the greatly reduced gloss and also the additional carbon, these would be very close to carbon pencils, perhaps a little bit short of the carbon pencils at about an 8.5. Let's see how these pencils perform in the smudge test. So once again, here's the HB. This is 4B. Here's the 2B. These pencils, similar to the carbon, are a little bit stickier than graphite pencils. There's kind of a stickiness, almost like a waxiness to them. Here is the 8B. So I'm assuming that they're going to smudge significantly less than the graphite. Let's see how they do. These perform almost like color pencils. They really resist smudging. So I would say probably they smudge even less than graphite. So if a graphite was, what was graphite? About a 4, I'm going to say that this is probably about a 5 on the smudge test, perhaps even a 5.5. Now let's see how they perform in the erasing test. Let's put down a few grades here. Here is the 8B. Let's see how they erase. Okay, the lighter pencil erases fairly well. And then, as predicted, the softer pencils don't erase quite as well. The 8B doesn't erase well at all. So in the erasability test, I would say they're fairly similar to carbon, perhaps about a 6 on the scale. Now let's see how water soluble they are. Okay, they perform very similarly to graphite, being just barely soluble in water. You can see they leave a little bit of residue. So I'm going to say that they're fairly water resistant, maybe about a 2.5. Now let's draw with these pencils and see how they perform. I have to admit that I'm usually wary of new materials, since in the world of drawing, there is very little new under the sun. And in most cases, the introduction of new materials is driven by the marketing department, rather than by a desire to help artists achieve technical breakthroughs. Furthermore, I wasn't a big fan of Staedtler's 8B graphite pencils, which I felt were unpleasantly sticky and too dark for the set. But I have to admit I was pleasantly surprised by this hybrid material, which manages to be a more effective alternative to oil-based charcoal in almost every way. It's hard and smooth like graphite, but with a full range of value, and with similar smudge and water-resistant qualities. This makes these pencils highly suited for sharp, linear techniques, including the cross-contour hatching I so enjoy using. I wasn't sure how I was going to approach this drawing since I've never used these pencils before, but sometimes the pencil will tell you how it wants to be treated, and in this drawing I decided not to do any soft blending at all, in part because I wanted to show the sharpness of the pencil strokes, but also because the drawing didn't feel like it needed any. I would say the only downside of these pencils is their relatively poor erasability, and of course if you're looking for a material that can be used with a blending stump, this definitely isn't it. As far as I know, Staedtler is the only company that makes this pencil, so this is the only one I can recommend. I bought a set of 5 pencils of different hardnesses for $11 on Amazon, so if you're looking for something that is graphite-like but darker and not as shiny, or looking for something that's like carbon pencils but smoother and better suited for a variety of different papers, I think this is an excellent option. Here is the completed drawing. Now let's talk about another black pencil category, the color pencil. These pencils contain a high percentage of waxes and oils, making them very sticky and also highly waterproof. There's also a variety of color pencils that are water soluble. Here's one made by Cretacolor, the Aqua Monolith. But these pencils are usually not used for drawing, but are meant to be put down and then diluted with wash. So we're not going to be discussing these. But here are 2 popular brands of color pencils. This is made by Prismacolor, and this is the Lyra Polychromos. Prismacolor is darker and waxier than these Polychromos pencils, but both are relatively waxy and soft. While these pencils are usually not used on their own, but rather as part of a full color set, working with color pencils does confer some advantages. So let's take them through the series of tests. In the chalky to greasy test, these pencils are on the extreme of the oily side, at about, let's say, a 9.5. The only thing being greasier is something like a China marker, a drawing material I don't use and can't speak on. In the darkness test, these pencils go very dark. So here is the Prismacolor pencil. Here is the Polychromos, which is not quite as dark. But both of them are still fairly dark, perhaps a little bit darker than charcoal, so I'm going to rate these at about a 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In the smudgeability test, these pencils rank very low, being almost entirely unsmudgeable. So here's a Prismacolor. Actually, I have them reversed. This is the Polychromos, this is the Prismacolor. Let's try smudging them. Barely smudging at all. Actually, the Prismacolor performs better than the Polychromos. In the erasability test, here is the Prismacolor. Here is the Polychromos. They erase quite poorly, being some of the most difficult pencils to erase. So the Prismacolor erases ever so slightly, and the Polychromos probably does a little bit better. But neither one are particularly good erasers, so let's put them at about a 2 on the scale. Let's see how these pencils fare in the water solubility test. Here is the Prismacolor. Here is the Polychromos. And as you can see, these pencils are almost entirely water resistant. even more so than graphite. So in the water resistance test, if graphite is a 3, these are probably a 1. Let's take these pencils out for a drawing test and see how they perform. Color pencils are a great option for those who need something that is entirely resistant to smudging and that works on every possible paper. And because they're excellent water resistance, they are a natural partner with watercolor wash. While my favorite pairing with watercolor is obviously pen and ink, color pencils can integrate with washes in a much softer, more organic way. By themselves, however, I have to admit they're not my favorite material, since they come in a limited range of hardnesses. The polychromos is too light for my taste, and the Prismacolor black is a little soft and loses its point all too quickly. But really, it's unfair to judge black color pencils on their individual merits, since they really are best used in combination with other color pencils or in a variety of aqueous mixed media techniques where really color pencils have no substitute. By themselves, however, they're too limited a material, so if you're looking for that buttery smoothness and a pencil that works on just about anything but glass, for that use a China marker, there are better alternatives, such as oil-based charcoal pencils or even the graphite carbon hybrids I just showed you. Here is the completed drawing. And lastly, we have pastel pencils, which are made from black pigments bound by hard gum binders to create a very chalky, loose material. Here are a few popular brands. One made by Stabilo, their Carbothello line. One made by Cretacolor, their Black Pastel. And then one made by Faber-Castell, their Pit Pastel line. Unlike charcoal or carbon or graphite, these pencils come in a single hardness. But since hardness varies from brand to brand, you can put together a set of pastel pencils that range in hardnesses. For example, Pit Pastel pencils are on the harder side, and Cretacolor is slightly softer, and the Carbothello is the softest of them all. On the chalky-greasy continuum, this pencil is on the extreme end of chalkiness. Because of a lack of oily or waxy binders, these pencils sometimes have a scratchiness to them, and the tendency for the material to fall off the paper. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, however. It just means that pastel pencils work better on rough, textured paper and are better suited for techniques that involve a degree of blending. So, on the chalky-greasy continuum, this ranks at, let's say, a 0.5. In the value range test, I find that these pencils go very dark, depending on the brand. So here is the Pit. Here is the Cretacolor. And here is, sorry, this is the Cretacolor. The previous one was the Carbothello. All three go really dark, but I think the Cretacolor is actually the darkest. So I'm going to rank these 10 on the extreme end of the value range. In the smudge test, so here is the Cretacolor, here's the Carbothello. Let's try smudging it. Because these pencils have minimal binding material, they are just about as smudgy as you can go. So if charcoal is an 8.5 or maybe even a 9, this is on the extreme end of smudginess, a 10. Let's see how these pencils do in the erasability test. Once again, here is the Pit. Here is the Carbothello. And here is the Cretacolor pencil. Because these materials are very chalky and dense, they tend not to erase very well. But there is a solution. The first thing you want to do is take off as much excess material as possible using something like a kneaded eraser. So this is going to lift off the excess pigment, and then you can pick up the rest with the hard eraser. Even then, I would rate these at about a 5 in the erasability test. So about the same as a carbon pencil, a little bit less erasable than your charcoal pencils. Let's see how these pencils do in the water solubility test. Here's the pit, here's the Carbothello, and here's the Cretacolor. Again, because these pencils contain only minimal binding material, they wash away fairly readily. And the only reason why some residue is left over is because there's a tendency for the pigment to stain the paper. So if I keep rubbing, more and more of the pigment will be washed away. So in the water solubility test, I'm going to rate these probably at around an 8.5 or even a 9. Let's take these pastel pencils out for a drawing test and see how they perform. Pastel pencils, like color pencils, are rarely used on their own and are usually part of a larger set where their ability to be blended easily with other colors is a huge advantage. They also work very well when paired with softer pastel sticks, since they're a harder material, permitting sharp details that are difficult to do with a blunt pastel. On their own, however, I find them very hard to control and quite harsh and scratchy, particularly on white paper. But their extreme smudge ability makes them great for soft techniques using a blending stump, where you can put down some material and then move it around or lift it with a kneaded eraser to get the effect you want. This, of course, works better on rough paper, where paper fibers can grab the material and keep it from moving too much or from falling off altogether. The technique in this drawing essentially consists of me putting down some pastel on the paper and then blending it. So really, the primary drawing tool is the blending stick rather than the pastel pencil, whose task is to add pigment to the paper. And at some point, the blending stump becomes so saturated with pastel pigment that it becomes the only thing I use in the drawing. That said, I don't like drawings that are overly soft, so toward the end I start introducing lines and hatching with minimal stumping, if any, to add detail and texture. Besides their unparalleled capacity to be smudgy, they're also the darkest black you can get, since they have high concentrations of black pigment and minimal binding agents and clays to keep them together. So if you're looking for a material with extreme blendability, but also tremendous value range, pastel pencils are the correct choice. Just choose a paper with a strong texture to hold all that loose pigment together. However, since these pencils tend to be quite soft and don't hold their point well, I would choose something else if you're going for sharp lines and hatching. That said, there's no reason why you can't combine materials together and throw some carbon pencil in there if you want those sharp lines. Here is the final drawing. Now that we've tested these pencils, what conclusions can be drawn? The main one is that none of these materials are better or worse, each having strengths and weaknesses, making them more or less suitable for different drawing tasks. And while I tried to be thorough in describing each material's respective properties, I was by no means exhaustive. For that to happen, I would have to try these pencils on different subject matter, work in different styles, do both longer and shorter work, draw large and small, and try out a variety of different papers, because paper type has a huge effect on what the material looks like. And even then, my conclusions can only be a starting point for your individual experimentation. The story becomes more complicated when you realize that in many cases, these pencils can be combined to mitigate each material's weakness. For example, soft, chalky materials that blend well but are too soft for sharp detail can be combined with harder materials to get sharp lines and textures. This is where having some idea of where the material falls on the chalky, greasy scale becomes important. Materials of similar greasiness will combine together organically, whereas materials that are far apart on the continuum tend not to play together quite as well. For example, oil-based charcoal and graphite work well together. Since oil-based charcoal is harder to erase, graphite can be used to do the initial sketch. And since oil-based charcoal produces sharp, dark lines that don't smudge, you can use it for your line work like you would a pen, and then use graphite blended with a stump over it like a wash. On the other hand, graphite and normal charcoal tend not to play as well together. So if I do an underdrawing with graphite, those areas will resist the charcoal, resulting in a patchy drawing. You could, I suppose, put down charcoal first, but graphite is so much lighter that there won't be any point to it. Charcoal and carbon pencils pair well together, however, being close on the chalky, greasy spectrum. So you can start the drawing with charcoal, blend it, create all kinds of atmospheric softness, and then put in your darkest lines and sharp details with the carbon pencil. The point is, it's complicated and really you're on your own. And though an instructor who knows your work and knows where you want to take it can help guide you along, possibly expediting the process of finding the right tools, this is still going to be a long journey of experimentation. The good thing is that it's going to be super fun, filled with drawings, both good and bad, perhaps some catastrophes, but also plenty of delightful discoveries. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please consider subscribing and perhaps even becoming a channel member. Thanks so much for watching, and see you back in my messy studio very soon. Bye for now.